I want to welcome everybody to the Multifamily Builders Council webinar. My name is Renee Grossman, Chairman of the board this year, and we're about to start our webinar. So thank you for everybody that's attending. Really appreciate your time this afternoon. The webinar is going to be recorded on the Dallas Builders Association, and we show it on the Dallas Builders Association YouTube channel and our social media. So you can tune into that if you want to show the rest of your organizations. We will also be taking questions at the end of the program, so please put any questions that you may have in the Q&A. You can find that feature at the bottom of your screen on the webinar. Questions will be answered at the end of the program, so we'll have time to do that. So without further ado, please help me welcome the National Vice President of Millwork for BMC, Mr. Paul Evans. Paul?
Renee, thank you very much for not only the introduction, but the invite. Misty asked me to talk to the Multifamily Council about, what's going on in the lumber business. And as you saw my title, I'm the National Vice President of Millwork. So I'm responsible for the pretty stuff. And I wanted to get an expert involved here that is responsible for the structural part of our business. And so I have the guy who I normally say that this guy purchases commodity lumber, but right now I think his job is just to find commodity lumber and get it to our location. So without further ado with that, let me introduce Tom Black. He's the Senior Director of Commodity Trading and Risk Management. And I want to get rid of the commodity trading and just focus on risk management part of his title, because that's what we're having him do right now is keep us out of the red, which we've been having a hard time doing here lately. So I really appreciate the opportunity that you guys are giving BMC to talk. I apologize, I'll have to drop off in about 30 minutes because as you all know, we've got a huge merger within our company. BFS is merging with BMC or vice versa, however you want to say it. And we've got meeting after meeting after meeting to get this thing done with the government agencies and so forth involved in it. So it's been kind of a hair-raising deal, let alone with all what's going on in the lumber business. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tom Black. He can fill you in on where we are in the lumber business right now. So Tom, take it over.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you for the invite here today. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys. Paul and I have been able to work together since 2015 when BMC and Stock Building Supply came together, and I've enjoyed my time working with Paul. Quite honestly, one of the great presenters. So I'll try to do him proud here today. So again, appreciate the invite and the opportunity. I'm going to be sharing my screen here in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to give a little backdrop. I've been with BMC and prior to that Stock Building Supply for going on 14 years. I have the pleasure of leading our commodity trading team. And to Paul's point, this past year, 2020, has been much less trading, and it's been much more survival and relationships, quite honestly. This has been the terms thrown around far too often as unprecedented. And there's no doubt that 2020 has brought its fair share of challenges. The presentation today is going to be heavily focused on really just trying to set the picture of not only where this year went, but very quickly why this year went the way that it did from a commodity availability and supply chain perspective. Where it's today and where we think there's a high potential for it going here as we transition into the latter half of the year and into 2021. Obviously, like I said, it's been a very challenging year. It has been my pleasure working with, I think, one of the best commodity trading teams in the country. And Paul made reference to the fact that we're merging with BFS here in the months ahead, and that's going to be very interesting as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and the PowerPoint. So again, hopefully that's coming through clear. Again, the point of this presentation, we're going to very quickly start on where the lumber market started, why it started, where it did. We're going to transition into where the market has been trading here recently and where we think it's going to go, giving you guys a future look. I hope you guys do understand, though, when we get to the last two slides, they are forecasts, and they're forecasts that have been put down on paper, which means they're automatically wrong at this point in time. But anyway, we'll get right to it. So for those that may have attended a webinar that we did with economist Ali Wolf here recently, I kind of coined the term Super V for 2020 because there were a lot of internal debates back in that March, April time period at the leadership level of our company about what was going to happen within the commodity market. If y'all remember, I remember reading a couple of analysts' papers back in the late March and early April time period. One in particular, housing expert who basically, the only way I can encapsulate their forecast was it was going to be the zombie apocalypse or the ending from Thelma and Louise for housing. You can see on this first slide what we've demonstrated here is total housing starts and then single family, new home, and single family housing. I know that this webinar is specifically geared at multifamily, but the topic is going to really drive around the consumption in single family because single family uses significantly more wood fiber than multifamily does. So and there's less substitution of other products like steel studs as an example. So we're going to focus on the impact that single family had here, but because it impacted the entire marketplace. So if you, again, go back and try to bring yourself past all of the quarantine, all of the stay-at-home orders, and go back to the onset of this, there was, again, many people thought that the run rates for the entire year after starting the year very strong, you could see back here in the January and February time period, housing starts were strong. Single family housing starts were strong, bumping up in that February time period, and new home sales were actually pretty strong. And then COVID hit. And I remember standing in front of a room in the Houston market. I do these types of presentations in normal times face to face. And I was standing in front of a room of a couple hundred people, delivering what, it's something we do every, in fact, it's the week of Valentine's Day every year. Delivering a presentation on what we thought the commodity market was going to do at that point. And again, to start the year back in January, we were all high-fiving, thinking that this was going to be a rebound year after 2019 was an abysmal year for the lumber and panel products in North America. And during that presentation, we got to the Q&A session at the end, and I will never forget this because it gave me a lot of insight into not pretending to know what is coming next or dismissing anything. A person much smarter than me once said, don't tell me what a market can't do, because a market will do exactly that. And this young lady in the audience asked me as we got to the end of the presentation, she asked me one simple question. And she said, what if that, quote, China flu, as she called it, comes ashore and into North America? What would that potentially do to all of the forecasts and potentially supply and demand? And I recall standing in front of the room and I couldn't help but chuckle. And again, I look back in that moment and I think to myself, God, what a jerk I was. But the reality is, the way I answered her was, we've had some other false scares in the past between MERS and between SARS in the past, the thought process was very simply, I dismissed it and said it's not happened in the past and it probably won't happen again, or won't happen in the future. Little did I realize what was going to happen less than 1 week later with the futures market when we had our first confirmed cases out in Washington, and lumber futures began to tumble at that point in time. Shortly thereafter, market prices began to tumble across all species and products. Availability started to become harder and harder to source wood fiber. And then in turn, we started seeing those doomsday forecasts in housing, which include, again, certain analysts predicting what would have been the equivalent of 400,000 housing starts for the balance of the year to get to the number that they forecasted. There were many of us that thought that that wasn't possible. And going back to the idea of the Super V, you have to go back and look at what commodity markets did in 2019. And as I mentioned before, they were abysmal. And I'll show a graph here in a minute. But as a result of the poor pricing in 2019, what happened is many mills, both on the lumber and the OSB side, decided to curtail or close facilities either temporarily or permanently. And that took a lot of production out of the supply chain. So when we started seeing curtailments then occur on top of what had already been announced in 2019, again, a lot of internal debate and thought around the idea, well, this thing, when it does actually bounce, thinking that this isn't going to go to the zombie apocalypse or the Thelma and Louise ending, this could create a problem. And as I get forward in the presentation, you'll see there were a couple dynamics that we foresaw, but there were two specific ones that we did not see. But when we talk about the Super V and what happened earlier this year, the idea was over 22 weeks, as an example, 2x4 number 2 Western Spruce. And I understand in Dallas, it's a number 3 market, but 2x4 number 2 Western Spruce is what is actually traded on the futures market. That is the CME futures lumber contract is that product. So we utilize that as the benchmark for many of our presentations and analysis. Over 22 weeks, that product gained $673 per thousand, nearly tripling in value. And to kind of paint what that number actually means in dollars, because per thousand is a commodity buyer parlance, basically took a car that was basically worth, $50,000 to $60,000 and added another $75,000 on top of it. So in the graph here on the lower left-hand side, you can see what we're doing is we're comparing historical bull markets to what happened in 2020. And what you're looking at here is on the length of the axis, the horizontal axis, it's the length of the bull market. So how many weeks? So if you look at this yellow one, that would have been 71 weeks. You can see on the vertical axis, what we're measuring is the amount of cost per thousand that this product actually went up. In comparison to other bull markets, this one not only did it the fastest, but it did it the steepest. And, from just a clear historical perspective, 2020 in many cases, and maybe 2021 is going to have to be thrown out when you look at historical graphs of commodity markets, because they're going to blow everything else out of the water for what it's worth. But again, we saw when some of those announcements came out and forecasts around housing's going to basically plummet in April. And again, going back one slide, we can see that in fact, single family home sales and home sales in general did drop going from February to March and March to April in the fear of COVID-19. But you could also see that we rebounded much quicker than anyone anticipated, right? So when we think about that Super V, there were basically 6 catalysts that we think about. A few of them were foreseen, a few of them were improbable, but there was the wild cards really. So the first foreseen catalyst was what I mentioned before about all the curtailments in 2019 and the impact that was going to have should housing not fall off a cliff. Again, I think even looking back on it, did I think it was going to rebound as quickly as it did? No, but I also didn't think it was going to go to sub 400 when you consider that I think the lowest housing start number that we hit during the Great Recession in 2009, 2008, 2010, in that time period was somewhere around 450,000 housing starts. So the general idea that we would have multiple months on a straight line below 400 was dismissible, at least to me. So that first one was, if housing didn't go to that number, and with all the curtailments that were announced at COVID-19, when demand was expected to drop off, or as one of my colleagues in the industry said, the boogeyman was expected to show up, what impact would that have on top of the curtailments that had already previously happened, 2019 and now at COVID, back in late Q1, early Q2. The second dynamic that was basically foreseen was, when you go back and you look at the shipments and the inventory levels of dealers and the amount of shipments that were put on rail cars, and this is something that's tracked by the American Association of Railroads, and you can slice and dice that information all the way down to, does it come from the forestry segment, does it come from petroleum, et cetera, et cetera. You've seen a steady or a gradual but steady decline since mid-year 2018. But what happened in 2018? I'll show you on the graph here in a minute. That was the previous time when the previous cycle that set all-time highs came to an end, and affordability became an issue within the marketplace. We had builders pull back. You go back and you look at housing starts in 2018. You had a robust first half of the year, H1. H2 was not very good. And as a result, what you had is a significant drop-off in the housing starts, and then a significant drop-off in demand. And lumber and panel producers did what they always do. They overproduce and they reacted slowly to the lessening demand. So we had one of the biggest corrections of all time up until that point. When that occurred, the entire supply chain fundamentally changed. We had publicly traded distributors, and I'm talking about like the Blue Lynxes and the Boise's of the world, who had to take massive write-downs of inventory values during that time period because, well, frankly, the market went from, I think, roughly 650 a thousand down to 300 a thousand, which doesn't sound like a big drop, comparatively speaking, to what we just went through today. But again, that systematically changed the way buyers acted. And from the second half of 2018 all the way through 2019, even including, factoring in the curtailments that occurred last year, buyers started to become shy. They started to not want to have big inventory positions. And as a result of this dynamic, you systematically, when you go back and you look at the American Association of Railroads, you have 2018 performing at this level from a total shipment perspective. 2019 was here. And then the first 4 months of 2020 was even lower. And even lower in the first 2 months of 2020 that were really robust, to say the least. So we had this systematic change. First one was going to be that we understood was the impact of the curtailment. The second one was a leaner supply chain, so people had less safety stock, right? One of the likely issues that were on the table were the production challenges from COVID-19. My colleague Paul had exchanged some emails with me here recently, asking me about basically builders associations attempts to try to get the government involved in getting mills back to work, right? And how and would that actually work? Well, I participated in an HBA call here in North Carolina, which is, I'm located in Raleigh, about a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago, and I heard a lot of that talk, jargon, rhetoric, however you want to phrase it, at that point in time, coming from, this was a coastal home builders association here in North Carolina. And I had to explain to that audience, and I'll take a moment to explain to you guys. That third bullet point on the right-hand side is specifically around the fact that there were likely impacts that we could all know were going to happen in a COVID-19 environment. Lumber mills, some of them are very, very modern, and they have, just by their design, they have associates socially distanced throughout the plant. I've been in some lumber mills that have as few as 10 workers on the floor. That's not most lumber mills. And definitely that's not any plywood mill that you've ever been to. In many older assets, whether they be plywood mills or lumber mills in the US South, workers are much more on top of each other, right? So in that type of environment, the mills had a hard time getting people to come to work, right? Also, you had a situation where during the onset of COVID, many of these mills announced curtailments, and with the curtailments came furloughs. And when they furloughed the associates, they furloughed them for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, up to 6 months. And when they were furloughed, they were given unemployment benefits. And as a result of what happened due to them receiving these unemployment benefits, what many mills, specifically in the US South, experienced was that their workers were actually making more money at home, not working, than they would have been in a high-risk environment, in a COVID environment, in the workplace. So they couldn't get them to come back. So when you think about a lumber mill may have 3 shifts that they run each day, right? And each one of those shifts may produce 1 million feet, right? But they were losing anywhere between a shift and a shift and a half per mill, per asset, per producer across the entire network. So we knew that this was going to happen. I don't think we realized it was going to be as widespread as it was. The improbable was what we talked about on the last slide with housing starts, new home sales, and everything recovering in the face of the high unemployment, the staggering unemployment, quite frankly. The reality is, though, and there were many of us in the industry that talked about this. Again, I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm originally from right outside New York City. I still have family up there, and I talked at length with them during this time period when COVID was ravaging New York City. It was a scary time. It was a scary place, and many of us in the industry who had loved ones who were very early on impacted by this. We saw this potential flight from the cities, and we started hypothesizing, what if this occurs? Well, it did, right? And despite the fact that the unemployment rate was so staggering, those people who had jobs that they could work from home, and this is something that has become very commonplace now. I see John Burns now talking about this, and his staff talking about this. Ali Wolf has talked about this. But those people who could afford a new house and maybe were living in a smaller house, they moved up, or they were living in an apartment, they moved out, right? So we've seen this resilience. The wild cards, if you will, and these were the 2 things that we just didn't predict at all, right? Was, I mentioned before in the second half of 2018 how slowly the lumber producers reacted to the lessening demand. Well, they learned a lesson, and they learned how to react quickly. That was proven at the end of Q1, beginning of Q2. Not in my career, nor I have the privilege, as I mentioned before, of working with and leading a group of 12 other traders. And I've have some gentlemen on my team who have been doing this for over 40 years. And none of them have ever seen an environment where a mill so effectively, mills plural, were able to take the knob and turn it down and just shut off the spigot on production. It's never happened before, but after what happened in the second half of 2018 and the curtailments it made in 2019, what we saw was a systematic playbook that was created across the industry. The final wild card, and this was the big one, was the impact of the home centers. I recall getting a text message from my sister who lives in Pennsylvania currently back in mid-April. And this is when things, we started to realize that this wasn't going to be as bad as it was going, as some analysts thought. My team started stepping back out and trying to acquire some lumber, and realized how difficult it was at that point in time. And I got this text message from my sister, and it was a picture of all of her landscape timbers and flower boxes and flower beds in the backyard that she built over a course of 2 weeks. And I remember texting back to her saying, stop going to Home Depot and Lowe's and buying all the lumber that's out there. Well, that dynamic continued for a long period of time. And what happened is, with the home center business, those mills have a very, very strict contract with many of those home centers. And I use Home Depot and Lowe's as the examples, but there are other ones out there. And they basically have a no-fail contract. So the mills were put in places that, although typically when you go in home centers, you typically see what we call a 4-square product, which is a premium prime product. It got to the point that the demand was so strong, they would then call and say, okay, well, ship me a number 1 product instead, which might look a little bit nicer, but it's more structural than it is appearance. Then the demand got so strong, they said, ship me a 2 common, ship me whatever you can, right? And that continued all the way well into June and early July. We have many suppliers that we do business with. We have very tight, confidential relationships that I won't divulge their names, but I will tell you that they shared with me their overall takeaway, that they do with home centers, keeping them anonymous, but showing me the takeaway out of the VMI, the vendor managed inventories that they have on a weekly basis. And they were literally trending for well over a month, over 100% year over year. And this was the final wild card that nobody foresaw, right? So what does that home center impact really make? Well, these two graphs, I'm going to simplify this whole thing by saying, basically the blue bar on each of those graphs represent the total weekly production in North America, right? Based on 2019 production. Okay, so these are very, very dialed in numbers, but they're estimates and their ballparks. Visually, this should paint the picture for you. So that's the blue bar on both of these graphs. So let's start in the one on the left. That yellow bar represents, and this is a typical waterfall graph, the yellow bar represents the home center or repair and remodel consumption. This consumption in North America varies annually, anywhere between 30% up to 45%, depending on who you're polling, what you're looking at, and what technically classifies as R&R, right? But if you take that weekly production and you assume that basic, call it just over a third, somewhere in there, that's 365 million feet per year, per week that goes into the R&R business. It's per week, right? The orange bucket represents all other segments. That includes industrial, that includes export, and that includes new home construction, whether it be single family or multifamily, right? So we all fall into that other, right? In the case of this example. That red bar all the way on the right represents the curtailments that occurred at the end of Q1, beginning of Q2 on a weekly basis and the impact that they had. So basically, the way that you put those three bars together, and what you have is they equal the blue bar on the left, right? Now, what you need to consider is what I shared with you about the home center business is that there's one idea that's stagnant. That's the blue bar there. Now let's look at the graph on the right-hand side. So that blue bar, same number, it is stagnant. It is the weekly production based on 2019. The red bar is stagnant because that was the overall impact of the curtailments at their height on a weekly basis at the end of Q1, beginning of Q2. If you then take in the fact that the home centers were outperforming every other segment for that period of about 6 weeks, and they've got that ironclad contract, what basically happened is the home centers increased velocity and takeaway pulled directly out of the orange bucket. The buckets could not move up or down in the sense of the overall amount that was available. They just had to borrow from other places, which meant that the new home construction segment, the export, when you look at exports, they were down significantly across the board out of any species, any port, all throughout 2020. And again, the industrial segment was down as well. So you put together the confluence of those 6 items on the last page, and in this visual example, I'm trying to and hope that this helps paint exactly what caused the market to do what happened and drive to what were all-time high prices. So that takes us from basically March all the way through September, right? And I put in here, there's a season, turn, right? So what happened now? If you look at this and what do the Boston Red Sox and lumber have in common? Well, I can use this analogy because I'm a Red Sox fan. In 2011, they had one of the worst collapses of all time. I remember watching that season. It was awful, right? Also, what happened, and that happened in basically the last 6 weeks of the season. Starting in the beginning of September and through the month of October, lumber had a very similar situation. Based on where my window is shown, basically, I'm going to move that. You can see that we hit all-time highs back here through the August and into September, where we toppled over. Now, again, I use the example just to kind of paint some scope. This, again, is 2x4 number 2 Western Spruce. Again, that's the futures contract, right? But this is going back from 2016 through 2017 through 2018 mid-year And this is the collapse I was talking about, that the producers were very slow to respond. And when I mentioned about how abysmal pricing was, it really was, comparatively speaking, pretty bad. And when you go back and you look at some of the overall inputs into what determines a lumber mill's profitability, when we went from here to here, you're going to see here in a slide or two exactly why that's such a big deal. But again, when we got to middle of September, basically we started to feel markets become soft. Product that was completely unavailable for months at a time. And when I say completely unavailable, I go back to the comments I made earlier about it being a situation of not trading, but just availability, right? My team was literally reaching out to suppliers, taking lumber for 8 weeks out, price not known, right, at all. This was the dynamic of the market all the way from basically May through, I'd say, late August, the beginning of September. What happened at the beginning of September? Well, we knew that, going back to the last slide, the bottleneck was really created by the home centers. Well, eventually when you get to the autumn, the home centers shift their focus. They go from lumber and R&R back to Christmas trees, Halloween decorations, rock salt, and snow blowers, depending on your region, right? However, you got to keep in mind that that's all seasonal, right? So going ahead, again, we've started this mass correction. Now we're looking at the lumber composite. Not only did we have the biggest climb of all time, but we've had the biggest correction thus far, coming down off of those highs. Each one of these red arrows point to when a market turned over. And very similar to the graph I showed earlier, we were looking at a comparison of the historic bull markets. We're now looking at historic bear markets. And the same principle applies here. The amount of weeks on your vertical axis and on your horizontal axis, on your vertical axis, the amount that the overall composite has moved. And when you look at it, again, just like on the way up, on the way down, it has lost more than any other market ever lost, number one. And number two, it's done it way faster. All right. So what caused it? Well, the home center business is part of it. The other part of it is this dynamic of what we refer to in the industry as lean by Halloween, which is this dynamic of every year overall inventories at wholesale lumber or distributors or LBMs like BMC or even BFS tend to hit their seasonal lows in the October time period. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. And it goes back to the home center dynamic that I think people don't realize how big a player Home Depot, Lowe's, Menards are in the overall lumber availability economy, if you will. But those products that really drive their sales from a lumber perspective are typically pre-cut studs. They may not be 92 5/8 or 104 5/8 or 116 5/8 like builders use, but they are going to be 8-foot PETs, precision end trim, 9-foot PETs, 10-foot PETs, right? And those same lumber mills that got into the pinch and the bottleneck earlier this year, they start producing that lumber usually in November for what they're going to start shipping in late December through January, because the home center supply chain is actually a heck of a lot more complicated than people realize it is. If you have mill X, they've got 13 mills in Western Canada, and they're producing home center product at 10 out of the 13 based on wood fiber. They don't ship that directly from that mill to a Home Depot. That product goes from their mill to an internal reload that they own. And then from there, it goes to a reload in markets. And then from there gets transloaded from either that reload to a Home Depot or Lowe's reload, or directly into their stores at that point in time. With all those touch points, it's a heck of a lot more convoluted. So the overall lead time is longer. So that seasonal low on overall inventories tends to occur in October, because there usually is a glut of inventory of specifically stud trims in the November, December time period, as the mills are trying to make this prime product. Well, you just don't make prime. You also make a prime, and you make a 2 and better, and you make a contractor grade. You make them all at the same time. lumber, that's just the way it works from a production standpoint. So when you think about that, some of the pullback that we saw is absolutely normal and seasonally expected, right? So something else to keep in mind here about what could happen as we move forward is when you go back and you look at a couple slides ago, I referenced 2018, we got midway through and then we saw the vast turn down, right? During 2019, I mentioned all the curtailments. Well, why did the curtailments happen? It wasn't just due to a lack of demand. It's because mills were hemorrhaging. Mills like Canfor, West Fraser, Interfor, Resolute, these are all Ecom, I believe, I'm not sure, but they are all, many of those are publicly traded companies that release their financials. And you can go and you can look at what they did in 2019. And what ended up happening is they were all hemorrhaging money and hemorrhaging cash. And although they made a ton on the way up here in these two lines, the orange line represents the Western spruce composite, the blue line represents saw log cost. That's just their input, logs that they buy from the forest that go into the mill. There's a trailing average in British Columbia. So the amount that they're going to pay for a log is tightly tied to what they paid for lumber 6 to 9 months previous. So again, I'm not trying to jump all over the place to give anybody about a vertigo, but if you think about that, in that 2018 time period, and think about that graph I just showed, as this price came off, their log input cost went up significantly. Same thing is going to happen here, right? So when we think about what caused the correction, home centers pulled back. Seasonally, building does slow down and consumption slows down as daylight savings takes place. Inventories lean out historically every year in October. But when you look at what happened back in 2018, there's a strong argument that can be made for the fact that overall lumber pricing, as it falls down, their input cost is going to go up significantly, which is going to, based on history, cause curtailments. The mills, despite the fact, and as insane as this sounds, that the futures board is trading today at 580 1,000, that they could curtail compared to, historically speaking, they would curtail at south of 350 or 330. It has everything to do with their inputs, right? And that trailing 6 to 9 month. So when we think about all those dynamics, what's next? I personally believe that so long as we are in a COVID environment, we are going to have a situation where the R&R business is going to be different. It's going to be stronger than it historically has been. And simply put, Ali Wolf, again, the economist from Zonda, who I presented with about a month ago, she put it very, very succinctly. People aren't spending money the way that they used to, going out to restaurants and movies and bowling and things along those lines. People decided to invest in their house where they didn't have the availability or the desire to move up. They just upgraded, right? So long as the discretionary income is higher, it's my feeling that when you take that factor of discretionary income being higher in a COVID environment, and you factor on top of that, that will create a higher home center demand. Seasonally, when you get to October, inventories always go down, but then if you go back and you think about that slide I put up there, they always go back up, right? And then the lean portion of the inventories that I gave the example of, my team was chasing lumber all summer long, sight unseen, right? And paying egregious amounts. I think what we're doing right now is going through a bit of a respite. It was needed from a market perspective, but this is a bit of a pullback that I think is being driven more by the seasonality of the product and the seasonality of the bottleneck creation device, which would be the home center business. But as we turn the corner and we get into next year, these are forecasts. And I say this, that, as I said earlier, as soon as you put them down on paper, they're probably wrong, but directionally, this is what I believe we're looking at. I believe that we're looking at this correction is a confluence of many dynamics that I've already mentioned, but the reality is nobody's been able to build an egregious amount of inventory. I can tell you that BMC, we were able to get to basically 40 business days of total supply chain, and that's all that we were able to maintain during this during this entire wild ride, if you will, of this lumber market. And we were probably one of the deeper ones. So no more than 2 months we were able to get and when I say supply chain, that's what's on the ground and what's on order at the mills that may not ship for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks in certain circumstances, right? So I look at what's going to happen in 2021, and it's highlighted here by this orange line, that I believe we still have a few more weeks of downward regression on certain products. Certain products have already started to turn. Southern pine, as an example, has hit a bottom. It hit a bottom, it has leveled out, and probably between now and, if it doesn't happen by the end of the year because of the inventory tax that occurs in Texas at the end of each year, it will definitely occur after the first of the year. We'll see a move up on the pine side. There's no doubt in my mind. But it has already hit a bottom and bounced back up off of that. If you look at 2x4 number 2 spruce and you look at the futures contract, again, that's what that is. That has already bounced. It got down as low as 460 a thousand, and it has bounced all the way back up to today. It's trading around 580. It still seems really, really small compared to being almost a thousand, but still, I think we've seen the lows behind us. This little dip right here is just semantics. It's whether or not we have winter weather in certain areas of the country. If polar vortex comes down over the upper Midwest, then we'd see that typical seasonal retraction that we see. If you look back to 2017, 2018, we saw the same thing here, right? You see, and excuse me, you see at the beginning of each year, whenever you have a winter weather storm, if markets move up too early, they tend to pause, maybe give back a little and go up. But if that doesn't occur, then it's just a straight line. But you can see fundamentally, this entire forecast is built on the idea of stronger home center business, stronger R&R in a COVID environment. And quite frankly, I don't know, I saw the news last night about the Pfizer announcement. We might be closer to a vaccine than not, but full distribution, I know that's without getting into any political topics, that can be debated as to when a vaccine, when it's available, how quickly it will be made available to the entire public. So this model is predicated on the idea that housing market's still strong. The R&R business comes back due to higher discretionary income after the first of the year, because right after December 25th, on December 26th, Home Depot, as an example, they shift all of their priorities to, I'm sure you've all seen the commercial, kick off your year, start it right, and it's about organization, which organization falls into R&R, right? So this model, again, has strength coming out for the first 5 months, and then sometime in that late Q2 period, thinking that we might actually have a vaccine, some semblance of normal life comes back to the American public, at which time we have a more seasonal correction. The one thing to note, though, and this is a forecast, and whether it's incorrect or not, the one thing everyone in the industry can agree on is that these numbers that we saw in 2019, based on the curtailments that we saw in 2019, those numbers are gone. They're far behind us. And I'm going to use one example. 2x4 number 2 Western spruce, the long-term average prior to this run that we were on this year in 2020 was 330 per thousand. There were times as recent as early this year due to COVID, it traded below 300. The new normal is probably going to be closer to 4 to 450, quite honestly, when you just think about it. And that has to do with the reduced capacity, reduced production coming out of Western Canada. So whether this is right on the discretionary income and the home center business coming back, what we can agree is that these numbers from 2019 are gone, and you can expect new higher lows when we're post-COVID, or if the R&R business doesn't come back, and maybe we don't go all the way back up to here. I would bet a ton of my money that we would trade somewhere closer to there. So that's the lumber forecast. On the OSB side, a little bit different story, and I haven't spent a lot of time talking about OSB because OSB it's not a quote unquote sexy item for the R&R business. It's not a big product at the home centers. But what caused this to happen was similar from an availability standpoint, but different from a bottleneck standpoint. The bottleneck was the availability. In 2019, the mills rationalized. They took out basically 4 assets on the OSB side. They took out 2 out of Western Canada and 2 out of the US Southeast. And when they did that, it normalized the production, the demand capacity ratios to a level to service roughly 1.2 to 1.3 million housing starts maximum. So long as we're in a 1.4 or higher, we're going to be in a situation where the OSB availability is significantly compressed. And the only thing that's going to turn that around is one of those 2 mills in the US South being reopened, either GP's Allendale or Norboard's Cordele Line 1, or there's an asset up in Eastern Canada that Norboard can open, or there were 2 out in Western Canada by different producers that were shut down last year. So OSB, we predict, again, higher pricing, but a different dynamic. It's not driven off the home centers in the R&R business. It's more driven off of just the overall availability of product. So I hope that's everything that we have at this point. I hope that helped to paint a picture of how we got to where we are today, and at least at BMC, where we think we're going as we look at 2021. So Misty, Renee, I'm perfectly fine to open up to any questions or Q&A, however you want to handle it at this point.
Okay, it looks like we have one question. It says, how were your specialty mills affected? Are they coming down at a slower rate?
If they mean specialty mills, I'm assuming they mean something like cedar products would be my guess. And if they can answer and clarify, that would be great. But cedar, if we're talking specifically about cedar as an example, cedar was definitely a challenge prior to COVID and prior to 2020 due to availability and duties. Quite honestly, the availability and overall supply chain on the specialty products was hampered just as much as they were on the more commodity type products. But the reality is those supply chains take a little bit longer to pass any reductions in cost through to the end user, because most of those supply chains are 2-step. And what I mean by that is those mills intended go-to-market strategy is typically to sell to a distributor like a Boise or a Blue Lynx, and then sell it from there to a BMC, a BFS, a McCoy's, whoever, right? So again, they were hampered just as much from the capacity side. They were already hampered from an availability perspective prior to COVID. And just the overall nature of the supply chain just takes a heck of a lot longer, unfortunately. So.
Okay, so he did specify, he said interior and exterior trim. And we also have another question about trim. It says, any update on the import trim material market?
Yeah, sure. So I wish Paul was still on the call to give a little bit more insight on that. It is not again, I handle the dimensional lumber and sheathing, the commodities for the company. I have a counterpart who handles millwork. I will tell you that, however, we are in enough team meetings and calls that I can tell you that the situation on trim coming out of South America specifically, and the impacts that overall the supply chain has felt based on what happened with the China tariffs last year and earlier this year, has made the supply chain incredibly compressed at this point in time. Availability has become an issue. Pricing continues to be an issue, but I would encourage anyone who needs more detail than that to either reach directly out to Paul or reach out to their local, if they deal with BMC, their local BMC millwork sales rep. Like I said, high level, it's same production issues that we see in the States, they're seeing down in South America from that has to do with COVID, right? And then you throw on top of that the wrinkle that came out of the tariffs earlier this year and late last year, that's made it worse. So.
Okay, next question is, truss manufacturing seems to be having trouble getting structural wood. Is there relief in sight?
Great question. Yes, there is relief at this point in time. And it's important for me to note for you guys that, and that's very observant. Like I said, that's a great question, because I have one trader who handles all of our pine products as an example. And he could not find MSR or number one at all. And that had everything to do with the home centers. The comment I made before about when they originally take the prime product and they said, hey, you don't have prime, send me number one. One of the other products that they substituted in there was MSR, that the mills would send them MSR, they'd send them DSS, they'd send them anything. I would tell you that as the seasonal slowdown occurred on the home center business, that product has now become more available. In fact, when you go and you look at Random Lengths and you look specifically at pine and how much Southern pine has dropped, that is specifically driven off of the amount of number one that became available during that time period. It wasn't a whole glut of number two. It was all this number one that the home center stopped consuming. So right now, there's plenty of number one and MSR and DSS product out there. My concern is, as I said during the presentation, is if the product or if the Home Depot Lowe's business comes back later, at the end of this year, beginning of next, that we'll face the same dynamic that we faced earlier, and that BSS type product will become difficult, right? And the MSR. But great question.
Okay, seems like that is all our questions for today.
Okay. Well, again, Misty, Renee, I appreciate the invitation, appreciate the opportunity to present to you guys. I hope that you guys found some benefit in the story, and it wasn't too deep down a rabbit hole for you guys. So. Renee, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry. Did we hear an echo, or am I okay?
No, we've got an echo.
I'm sorry. About now, is that better?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Tom, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hey, I got a quick question. And I know you touched upon this, but if there becomes a vaccine in say next year, how quickly does lumber pricing come down?
I would tell you that it's completely contingent on how that home center business responds after the first of the year. Because if the home center business does not come back as expected, then lumber pricing will kind of stay in this range it's in today, right? If it does come back, I really don't think it's, meaning the Home Depot and Lowe's business, if it comes back as strong as it did for 2021 as it did in 2020, I think you're looking at H2 of next year before things begin to regulate.
Okay.
And then keep in mind my comment around once things regulate, I really firmly believe that we're looking at probably, and I said this to start the whole presentation, a smarter man than me said, don't tell me what a market can't do, because it will do just that, right? We'll probably have seen the all-time highs in lumber. They call it a black swan event for a reason. But having said that, what I can guarantee is that the lows are going to be much higher than they used to be, right? Moving forward. So.
Okay, great. Thank you again for Tom and Paul. I know he exited, but if you could thank him for us on behalf of the Multifamily Builder Council. So we really appreciate it, Tom. Thank you again.
Yep.
I know we have 30 plus participants in today's webinar. So I want to again thank everybody for that. Real quick announcement. The Multifamily Builders Council, we are not having our Christmas party this year, but we are still doing our Toys for Tots. And that's going to be on December 3rd. It's going to be a drive-by at the Dallas Builders Association in Plano, our headquarters. And that's going to be from 11 to 2 o'clock. So we still consider Toys for Tots one of our charities. The giving kids out or giving toys to the kids is still super important to the Multifamily Builder Council and the DBA. So please Still, we're going to be sending an email flyer to all the members of the Multifamily Builders Council and the DBA. So just put it in your calendar on December 3rd from 11 to 2. There will be a drive-by Toys for Tots at the Dallas Builders Association in Plano. One more quick announcement: in February, will be our next webinar, and we are trying to get at this point to secure an industry forecast company similar to RealPage. So we're working on that. So put in your calendars for that February meeting. So without further ado, I think that wraps it up. I want to thank again our guest speakers, Tom Black and Paul, and everybody that's on this webinar today. So thank you, everybody.